When you hear Atari Flashback, you probably think of AtGames. This makes sense because they did make a lot of the Atari Flashback plug-and-play consoles, but the first two iterations were actually not. Since AtGames was not involved, were these consoles actually good? Let's take a look. What's going on? It's Podrez coming at you with another video. Alright, so if you've seen a couple of my videos and you like what I do, hit that subscribe button right there. We did recently hit 20,000 subscribers. Thank you, the viewer, for helping me get there. And check out our Discord server, discord.podrez.net. I'm also going to put a link right in the description. Anyway, let's look at the Atari Flashback consoles. In the early 2000s, Atari commissioned the company Legacy Engineering Group to make a plug-and-play unit. The company was owned by Curt Vendel, who was an Atari fan. He ran the website Atari Museum, which was a preservation site for all things Atari. So Curt was definitely the right person to oversee this new project, but how did it turn out? The unit itself looks like a 7800 but smaller. The controller is identical to the consoles based off of, but much smaller. I actually prefer the size, but it does feel cheap. The console cannot play cartridges, but it does have 20 built-in games. There's even 7800 games, which is obvious because of the console design, but still surprising because you usually don't see Atari compilations that feature 7800 games. In fact, this is the only Flashback console to have 7800 games. The game list is decent. They have a majority of the classic arcade titles on here, but there's a few obvious ones that they missed. Why no Ninja Golf? That's one of the best 7800 games. I'm not a fan of the menu. You can only move through the list of games vertically, and you can't see what game it is until you hover over it. The Atari 10-in-1 console by Jakks Pacific had a better menu because you could move horizontally and it was easier to pick the game you wanted. Upon playing some of the games, I noticed some oddities right away. Breakout and Warlords are on here, but these normally don't require paddle controllers. How are they able to get these games working with a regular controller? They really messed up Asteroids. There's no momentum when you move. You move at a fixed speed and you stop on a dime. In the original version, there is momentum and inertia keeps your ship moving in the last direction you were going, just like in space. How did Legacy Engineering Group mess up this game so badly? Gravitar has the same problem. You move at a fixed speed and there's no inertia to keep you going, although there is gravity. The game is significantly harder too. The enemies are much more aggressive than the actual 2600 version. In Yar's Revenge, you're unable to move diagonally. And no, it's not because of the controller. In Crystal Castles, you can move diagonally. Speaking of which, Bentley Bear walks diagonally in a perfect 45-degree angle, but the levels themselves are not at a 45-degree angle, so you just end up hitting walls. This makes the game significantly harder to play. The original 2600 version allowed you to walk in the same diagonal direction as the level, so you didn't have this problem. I don't know how they messed it up here. Battlezone doesn't have as much color or detail in the graphics. This is unfortunate because the actual 2600 version looks incredible. Also, similar to Gravitar, this version is harder because the enemies are more aggressive. The audio with every game sounds much different than their counterparts. Desert Falcon is a good example. Listen to this. Now listen to the actual 7800 version. The game Saboteur is on here, making it the first time this title has ever been publicly released. Unfortunately, like the others, it's not completely accurate to the actual 2600 version. The spaceship is flickering during the cutscene, which did not happen in the original. You also cannot shoot as many bullets at a time as you could in the original. It's unfortunate that the game's debut was butchered like this. So what am I getting at? Well, it's obvious these games are not running on original hardware or emulation. The console itself is just an NES on a chip and the games were written completely from scratch. To compare, the Atari 10-in-1 was also NES on a chip, but the games were fairly accurate to their 2600 counterparts. The Flashback 1 though has some obvious mistakes that do take away from the experience. This collection is playable, and it will get your feet wet if you're trying Atari games for the first time, but if you're looking for accuracy, this is not it. So why did the console turn out like this? Curt Vendel himself did talk about this in the Atari Age forums. According to him, his team was going to use hardware that was identical to the original 7800, but Atari wanted Flashback 1 to be released by Christmas of 2004, which only gave his team 10 weeks to make it. Using identical 7800 hardware would have taken much longer than 10 weeks, so they had to settle for NES on a chip. To compare, the Jack-specific Atari 10-in-1 plug-and-play console, which was also NES on a chip, was made in 8 months, and that was only 10 games. The Flashback 1 was made in a little more than 2 months, and that was 20 games. Big difference. Despite some of the critical feedback, the Flashback 1 was still a success, so Atari would commission Curt Vendel's team to make a sequel. In August of 2005, we got Atari Flashback 2. The design resembled the 2600, but smaller. The controllers not only look like 2600 controllers, but they are. They even work with the original hardware. This is very interesting. Could it be that they did not use NES on a chip this time? This time they went all out. Rather than just 20 games, they gave us 40. Vendel even commissioned some programmers from Atari Age to make hacks and homebrews for this. That's really cool. The game lineup is also excellent with a lot of classic Atari titles and even some unreleased games. Surprisingly, 2 of Activision's games made it on here, which is incredible. There's a few missing ones though. It's interesting that Radar Lock made it on here, but not Solaris. There's also some paddle games that you can play by putting in a code. You can only do this if you have your own paddle controller though. The menu is a big improvement over Flashback 1. The games are nicely organized under categories, which makes it easier to find the game you want. Now that we got that out of the way, let's play some games. This collection has a lot of the earlier Atari games that you would expect. Maze Craze is a basic game where you just have to find your way out to win. The game has a surprising amount of replayability, however, because it generates a new level each time. In Dodge 'em, you must collect the dots and avoid the opposing car, which will try to ram into you. Flashback 2 also has a lot of later releases. Off the Wall is a decent breakout clone with items that give you special abilities. For whatever reason, Atari didn't give this game analog controls when it first came out, which makes it a great title for Flashback 2. Radar Lock is a very ambitious flight simulator with an impressive rotation effect. Secret Quest is a Zelda-style adventure game that managed to fit 8 levels into 16 kilobytes of ROM space. Of course, some of Atari's arcade ports made it on here. Battlezone thankfully looks much better than it did on the Flashback 1, and I didn't notice any sound or emulation issues. Missile Command also plays exactly like the actual 2600 version. I always preferred this version over the arcade because you only have one missile base, which is less confusing. Millipede is a little odd. As we can see, my unit has the version made by Atari, but some revisions of Flashback 2 have the GCC version, which is much different. Speaking of revisions, the game Quad Run normally has a digitized voice, but unfortunately mine is missing it. There were revisions of Flashback 2 that do have the voice though. Quad Run. Like I mentioned before, Flashback 2 had some homebrew games from Atari Age. Atari Climber is a platformer where you must collect the white squares while avoiding the moving walls. You can make the walls change direction, but you lose time on the clock. If you touch the walls or run out of time, you lose a life. This is the best homebrew game on here in my opinion. Lunar Lander is another homebrew game that was included. This one is playable, and the screen even updates to a more zoomed in perspective when you get close. For some reason, they included a homebrew of Pong that doesn't use analog controls. This is strange because there were some secret analog games that were included on here, which we'll cover soon. This collection also received a few ROM hacks: Adventure 2, Yar's Return, and Return to Haunted House. These games are nothing more than just a basic level hack. Return to Haunted House I'm especially disappointed with because it's a hack of adventure rather than the original Haunted House. The worst part is that these ROM hacks have been included in many future collections like Atari 50, as if people really want to see these. By putting in a button combination, you can access the secret paddle section. It's not much, only 2 games. I tried using my paddle controller from my actual 2600 and it works perfectly. Both games feel exactly like I'm playing them on an authentic Atari 2600. Speaking of authenticity, there's a reason I haven't noticed any issues with the games besides the voice and quad run. Curt Vendel was able to recreate the original hardware onto a single chip, so this isn't emulation, it's the real thing. And considering this unit supports composite, you're going to get better picture quality than you would have on original hardware. Because you get 40 games and it's the original hardware on a chip, this is one of the best ways to play 2600 games. Like with the predecessor, Flashback 2 sold very well. With that console being successful, Curt Vendel was planning on creating Flashback 3. In an interview, when he was asked about what this upcoming console would look like, he said, "It will be based on the 2600 architecture, but this time we are enhancing the game experience with newer display and interfacing technologies and putting the system together into a form factor that Atari had never done before delivered the gamers." With how good Flashback 2 was, I can only imagine what 3 would look like. Unfortunately, it never happened. Atari would end up not rehiring Curt Vendel for this project. Instead, AtGames was behind Flashback 3 and all the sequels after it. AtGames went in a questionable direction with the Flashback series, undoing the standard that Vendel and his company set. Rather than real hardware on a chip, AtGames would start using software emulation, which would become the new standard for the Flashback consoles. There's nothing wrong with emulation, and these consoles certainly aren't bad, but in terms of accuracy and authenticity, it will never hold a candle to real hardware. Hey, I just wanted to thank you so much for watching this video. If you made it this far, hit that like button. If you enjoy this type of content, hit the subscribe button for more content. Both of these things really help the channel grow. If you have anything to share, feel free to leave a comment. I read every single comment on this channel, and I'm pretty good at replying back. Anyway, have a good one.